Hello, my name is Brant Hunt, and tonight going to be sharing a particular book from Alvin Kuhn's book, The Shadow of the Third Century. The title of the chapter is chapter 12. It's called Crumbs from the Table of Gods. And let's see what we got here. It looks like we got, let's see what we got. We may have some difficulty with the internet for some reason tonight. I don't know what's going on again. It's like a poor signal for some reason. As soon as I got on here, it suddenly kind of dissipated here. See how it works. Anyway, we're going to be reading from this particular book tonight. This is again from Alvin Kuhn. Like I said, The Shadow of the Third Century. This is chapter 12. And we're going to change it right here for me to easy read it. So, in the life of a culture, the conversion of figurative speech and ritualistic allegorism over into veridic history is the incredible fact of mightiest import for the world in 2,000 years. It strikes one as a thing past all belief. It is impossible to credit as a factual occurrence unless one has given years of study to detect its subtle evidences. As Higgins has so well said, it took place in a long and gradual process. Yet the evidences are nearly subtle nor vague after all. They are open, glaring, and breathtaking. In the end, instead of being difficult to discover, they are ubiquitous. There is nothing else to be seen. There is no other way to explain what happened, what has come to pass. It provides the only formula that enables one to fit together the facts as they stand into consistent rationalization. It must have occurred since no other eventuality can explain the situation as it exists. To prove it, finally, it is only necessary to take the ostensible, quote unquote, history, end quote, that was precipitated and molded out of the mythologies and dramas. Turn it back to the original mytho-allegorical relevance, and one has reconstituted the structure of primeval thought out of the which all religions and philosophies took their rise. Then turn it all again back to history, and one is immediately founded in the mires of events that can only be admitted to the pale of history by being accepted as miracles. They become such unlikely happenings that it is impossible to include them in the common category of real history as man knows it. They get into history only by the doorway of a miracle. And that is precisely what the mind could assume as likely to be the case when the extraordinary mechanism and strategies of allegory must be made to fit into a Procrustean bed of believable events. Allegory becomes a fantastic personage and parade of history. This has been the origin of supernatural in scriptural literature, the force of dementia that lifted the book from the manual of righteousness to a fetish of prodigies, before which reason bows in admiration of its prerogative. So the great scriptures become entreating records of God's arbitrary decisions and unpredictable performances, and lost their power as dramatizations of poetic structures portraying the realities and the scheme of man's life and the modes of his evolution from animal to human to divine status. They become wonder books of God's greatness and his whimsical, capricious dealings, not with man as a whole, but with a alleged, quote, chosen people, whom he has selected to be the special objects of his favor and his interests. and this interpretation has wrought the unspeakable costly demolition of man's complete confidence in law, both natural and moral, as the fixed axis of the universe, and substituted for it his belief that his safety is to be won by Kajorian, a capricious deity who transcends and flouts his own laws. All the various cults and systems of religious character bore, B-O-R-E, it can be assumed a more or less clear, precise, and authentic segment of inheritance from Augustine's primeval, quote, true religion, end quote. It can be presumed that the most esoteric ones carried a closer and more complete approach to the original intricate representation of it. The exoteric and popular ones a more partial and diffuse copy. Such unquestionably was the case, for it has ever been so. A popularized religion must necessarily less a integer meaning than an esoteric one. The idea next is sequenced to be noted and stamped indelibly forever, henceforth, upon the minds of Christian people, is that Christianity was not in the remotest sense a move of more knowing people away from or in opposition to any form of pagan religion, but on the contrary was just a slightly new, if new at all, alignment, combination, or expression of pagan culture itself. It was in no sense, even when it had conquered all rival interests, the end of paganism as its universal ally belief. It was composed of nothing that paganism had not already furnished, except a infinitely more impossible miscomprehension of paganism material, which it appropriated and built up on. It was nothing but more paganism, but a reformulation of it on principles never hitherto brought forward to rationalize, rather to de-rationalize its tenets. It was paganism refurbished with a, quote, lying gloss, end quote. It was pagan philosophy misappropriated, misconceived, misapplied. It was legitimate enough offshoot of pagan culture, but an offshoot malformed and disfigured. So far from being anti-pagan, it was entirely pagan, but not good paganism. It was paganism run out into a foul corruption and innate nonsense by the disfiguring power of ignorance. It was paganism purloined from the sanita of the mysteries and thrown out into the multitude to be mauled and pillared in the most atrocious despolitization of high truth ever seen. The item that would have given scholars the adequate basis for a correct answer to the inevitable question as to how the religion could have arisen and spread so quickly had there been no new messenger is now to be dealt with. Failure of scholars to grasp this answer has permitted the old assumptions to stand unchallenged and to control all belief. Scholars have failed to discern it because the presence of the, quote, history, end quote, eliminated the need to trace any other origins of Christianity. The destruction of documents added to the difficulty. Nevertheless, the data and evidence are open and plain and overwhelming. The millions who have lived and died in the Christian faith have never doubted that the religion had its beginnings as a result of the divine man who came in the flesh to give it its initial impetus and fixed its supernal character. How? They have asked when faced with a contrary view, could the mighty sweep of Christian piety have gathered conquering force if there had been no figure of outstanding personal power to start it? Surely Christianity had its founder and also its nuclear inception from the little band of consecrated and transfigured men who had gathered about him and seen the many demonstrations of his divine messengerships. Movements do not originate movements do not originate out of the thin air. They must be implemented and empowered by some leader. Ideas do not propagate themselves. They are advanced by men whom they have inspired to heroic action. Surely the great Christian upsurge could not have taken form and developed power except from the driving force of a dynamic preachment by a dynamic personality. Viewed superficially and without a knowledge of the details of actual history appertaining to the event, this is the belief that stands fixed in the general mind of Christendom. That is, it is completely false belief, wholly unsupported by the data of history, the aim of this work. It did not need the presence or the preachment of any man to generate it. It took from naturally and spontaneously out of the element's existence at the time and place of its birth. It did not spring from the introduction of anything new from without or above. It was the inevitable product, perhaps better to say byproduct, of what was already destined to precipitate it. It came not as the release of new unction from on high, for it required the presence and operation of but one element in the situation to produce it. The world today may well recoil aghast at the pronouncement of that one word, for it is ignorance. Given what was on the ground in the form of venerable ancient schools of secret wisdom on the one side and the untutored populace on the other, the one thing that alone could leaven the masses with a ferment of religious enthusiasm of the form that did come to manifestation was ignorance. With every necessary prerequisite for such a development provided by the features of the situation. It is the simple truth, as Lecky, L-E-C-K-Y, has stated it, that, quote, Christianity floated into the Roman Empire on the wave of credulity that brought with it this long train of Oriental superstitions and legends, end quote. But this is but a preliminary hint of what is to come in the way of a more specific corroboration that the Christian faith was launched by, quote, men whose ardent was fierce in proportion to their ignorance, end quote, as Massey puts it. It is as clear as any historical fact can well be. But one of the most nicely accurate views of what happened in those fateful early years that fixed the character of history from then to this very moment is given in words of momentous gravity by G.R.S. Mead, M-E-A-D, in his Fragments of a Faith Forgotten, where speaking of the, quote, rape, R-A-P-E, end quote, of the mystery schools and their esoteric doctrines by the new upheaval, he writes on page 113, quote, so what I'm gathering what I just read here, basically what happened simply is they got this information from the esoteric schools. That is the libraries, such and such, they basically raped them. They took them from the mystery schools, you see. Now, here's the quote from G.R.S. Mead. The new method was to force out into the open for all men a portion of the sacred mysteries and secret teachings of the few. The adherents of the new religion itself professed to throw open everything, and many believed that it had revealed all that was revealable. This was because they were as yet children. So bright was the light to them that they perforce believed it came directly from the God of all gods, or rather from God above. For they would have no more of gods, little g. The gods were straightway transmuted into devils. The many had begun to play with psychic and spiritual forces let loose from the mysteries, and the many went mad for a time and had not yet regained their sanity, end quote. If the story of Christianity's rise had to be condensed in a dozen lines, this passage would tell the story better than any other that could readily be found. Indeed, the last sentence alone carries the gist of it all. It is the direful account If it is denied to be the true story of the rise of Christianity, it is at any rate a true account of what occurred in immediate connection with that upheaval. And it is the record of the popular ferment that brought in Christianity. If the modern student needs either confirmation of Mead's analysis or a instructive parallel of the same set of circumstances, he has but to look at what he finds before him in his world now. The situation is parallel unbelievably, beginning openly after centuries of hidden existence. Some 60 or 70 years ago, there were launched a number of movements, notably modern theosophical, with a commitment revival of Rosicrucianism and kindred forms of occult and esoteric systematicism, all tracing for far descent from the same ancient body of teachings that the rampant early Christians pilfered from the mysteries of old. And again, we are called upon to witness the scramble of the many, quote, for these pearls of truth and the exhibition of the various degrees of, quote, madness by many of those cults in one of the marked features of the modern scene. So Mead, following sentence must be noted in page 115. Quote, in things religious, there is no middle ground among the uninstructed. They fly to the opposite pole. Therefore, when the new impulse seizes upon people, we are to have a breaking down of old barriers and a striving after a new order of things. But at the same time, a wild intolerance, a glorification of ignorance, a wholesale condemnation, a social upheaval, followed by a political triumph. One thing, however, is acquired definitely, a new lease of life for faith, end quote. Here we have before us to accurately analyze the, quote, making, end quote, of such a religious, social, political upheaval as that on the wings of which Christianity floated in upon the early Roman Empire. Now in brackets it says, in the case under consideration, it must be noted that while the final political denouncement was fondly envisioned as the earthly consummation of the whole program of faith, it signally failed to come to realization. The whole hyper-fervent frenzy collapsing at its very height with the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus in AD 70. Mead's analysis states our case with great clarity. He notes the expression that fatal, quote, glorification of ignorance, end quote, and hatred of philosophical rationalism, which we have asserted as prevailing and sweeping the movement on like a torrent into violence and boundless fanaticism. Also, he marks in it the same surrender of an intellect to faith. Fuller, in brackets here, History of Philosophy, page 256, adds strength to Mead's point of view. Quote, the revival of the Orpheus Pythagorean religious cult was incidentally to a rising tide of religious interest and fervor that was creeping into the Roman world from the Near East as early as the 2nd century BC, and that 400 years later had completely engulfed the empire, end quote. This is a key statement in the wake of the one from Leakey given above. 100 other authors would fall in line with similar testimony. The facts are indisputable. Christianity came up from the masses almost. It might be said at the backwash of the great surge of a lofty philosophical movement that about that age of the world had crept in from the ever mystical East. It can be described as a backwash because it was the repercussion, the secondary impact, following the first impingement of the inrush of Oriental psycho-spiritual philosophies. The first impact of mystical religion preachments falls upon the more intellectual class who have supplied a measure of the accoutrement necessary to distinguish the higher values of the religious experience. These classes can hold it in a fair degree of balance and sanity. It can among them give rise to cults of profound philosophical interests, such as those that flourish so markedly in the great cosmopolitan center of Alexandria. But when in the course of a little time the profounder contends filters down to the nether strata of society, they become inevitably the source spring of such irrational agitation as Mead had described. This is the backwash that sets in following every pronounced religious stirring, and our work is to show conclusively that Christianity was the product of that great popular repercussion from an extraordinary migration of Oriental religions of spiritual and mystical dynamism into the West. To some extent, Christianity was the product of the most profound of esoteric teachings, yet at the same time, it is the least esoteric of religions. The true description of it is that it sprang from esoteric sources, but emerged as the most esoteric of all. So what you're saying is simply it got its formulas from esoteric sources, but when it came out and revealed itself, it was exoteric. It was literal. It wasn't in a myths. It wasn't in stories. It wasn't basically sharing, but yet the hidden part of it also. It was built on and from the material of religious systems that proclaim as their core of truth the existence and saving activity of a divine principle, a variable Son of God in the heart of every human. Yet it was the system that supplanted the predication, I should say, and central importance of this divine principle with a historical Jesus. Schools teaching the essential divinity of a portion of man himself existed prolifically when Christianity arose, if not directly out of one or another of them, or from a eclectic or synthetic amalgamation of a number of them. Christianity stemmed forth into existence. Nearly all of the early contributors to the cult's most enlightened tenets at first were themselves members of the several Hellenistic or Egyptian mystery schools, as many writers do actually assert. Integral evidence points to the fact that Paul himself had been a member of the Eleusinians, the Dionysus, or Bacchial mystery schools. Augustine had been a Manichaean before embracing the faith of Christ, which he did do this with Ambrose of Milan, Italy. Tertullian joined in with the Montagists, who rather felt that Montius was the Messiah, Avatar, rather than Jesus of Nazareth. Justin Martyr was not averse to parading the identity of an Old Testament prophecy with the oracles of Sabellus. And Ammonius Saccas, Saccas, is said to have been converted, quote, to Christianity after launching the great Neoplatonic release of Hidden Truth. It was Plotinus who gave Augustine the true significance of the Trinity doctrine. Such instances can be multiplied. Christianity was beginning to take form out of the elements that were extant and infirmant in those early days. So what they're saying simply is what the other writer I was reading last night is that this all combination of this stuff was mystery schools and this somehow we know somehow that they basically got their writings but they didn't understand them, but they used them in order to bring this whole thing together. And I would gather simply there was some masterminds involved with this at first. Important as evidence at this point is the statement found in the famous letter of the Emperor Hadrian to Sir Benedict. It puts beyond question the intimate connection of some of the most intelligent early Christians with the pagan mysteries. Says Hadrian, quote, "Those who worship Serapis are likewise Christians, even those who style themselves the Bishop of Christ are devoted to Barabbas, end quote. Even this one bit of authentic testimony puts to rout the universal Christian belief that Christianity arose to an entire independency of or in revolt from antecedent pagan systems. It stemmed from religious soil enriched with the accumulated deposit of age-old growth. Indeed, when the movement first began, it had little or nothing to distinguish it from other sporadic outbursts of religious expressions among pagan groups. It bore few of the characteristics which marked its later as distinctively the Christian religion. Its minor diversions were in no sense anti-pagan. They were simply divagations from basic principles, just as all schismatic movements in any religion are. But within a all too brief period of time, there was to come nearly a complete reversal of position, a wholesale turnabout that was to lift the new cult out of the family of pagan religions altogether and bring it under a classification that had ever since been sharply set over against them. So this whole idea simply is that, if I gather what he's talking about here, simply is this, that this explosion of all this pagan thoughts is being put there out. But the problem was people didn't understand paganism, didn't understand what they were talking about. And could it be that simply is that they took it literally instead of esoterically? You see, plus there were many different groups. I know Manichaeism, which has had an enormous impact upon Augustine. I've known that in the past, you see. But I never put this together like these guys have put it together here. Let's see where I'm at here. So the new rabbit movement was soon to fly completely off the solid ground of every one of these basic fundamentals. From esoteric secrecy, it flew to the letter of the myth or the allegory or the symbol, and from the spiritual nature of the gods or the Christos, it leaped clear down to a god, capital G, in the form of a man of flesh. In so doing, it quickly ceased to be pagan, and became strictly anti-pagan, carrying, unfortunately, the reverent name of Christian with its apostasy. As the more capable minds which early in the movement had grasped and adhered to the esoteric nature of the doctrines passed off the scene, and their place was taken by men of cruder intelligence, degeneration rapidly set in. The allegorical, mystic meaning of Scripture, dimly as it may have been caught by the first leaders in their attempt to popularize the cryptic messages of the Gospels, was soon reduced to the whole little historical rendering, and the mental habit was in full cry. The fogs and mists that were to deepen into the dismal murks of the Dark Ages were gathering their gloom. First or more intelligent reaction to the invasion of Eastern spiritual ideas soon gave place to the second. With the latter, Christianity was metamorphosed from itself into something else, called Christianism. Much of our thesis is upheld by what Fisher says in his work already cited in page 374. Quote, the church, including the apostles themselves, was to be enlightened gradually as to the real import of the master's teachings by the influence of the Spirit and by the gradual course of divine providence. Especially is this true of his prophetic utterance, which offer glimpses of particular ends and other symbolically forms of the future of his kingdom, the full meaning of which time alone could unveil. End quote. If this says anything important, it is that the simple-minded second century agitators, I should say, of a popular ebullition of religious feeling, handling esoteric material, they had not the acumen to understand any more than a fifth grader. Comprehending the propositions of Einstein or the quantum theory, were at the beginning wholly ignorant of the inter-significance of the treasures they were bandying about, and would have to wait the slow education of time and its lesson to write out for their case crass faculties the hidden purport of their own documents of creed and dogma, rite and symbol. That even took two millennia of development history since then have not brought the expected enlightenment to the deluded fathers of the simple fishermen of Galilee, Prince, large, very large, the doleful ineptitude of the early expectations of such apologetic reasoning as Fisher. Could anything now be more corroborated of the exegetic position here defended, as well as more devastating to the opposite orthodox views than this surprising, frank, and revealing statement from Fisher, that is page 458, quote, "The full blaze of truth would not have enlightened, but had dazzled and misled those who were not prepared by previous training to recognize it. The minds of men, even of the apostles, must by degrees be educated up to the apprehension of truth, which clashed in many of its features with their traditional ideas." End quote. One of the fathers called Chrysostom, that is spelled Chrysostom, declared that these simple fishermen, quote, outshone all the world, end quote. But Fisher thinks they were behind and had to be gradually educated up to what intelligent men had already knew. It is well to note these disagreements, discrepancies, and inconsistencies. It is not acrimony, but simple truth, worthy, however, of notice to say that had our pen put down in our own words the gist of the paragraph of Fisher, it would have been received with ill grace, sudden resentment, and positive denial. But a Christian partisan proponents have written these lines. At that, it paints the same picture that we have just exhibited from Mead's brush. Light has come into the hands of people who are no more than children of intellect, and as if first dazzled and blinded them with its effigies, so it later afflicted them with madness and frenzy as its uncomprehensible mysteries and unbalanced philosophies drove them into wild excesses of passionate zeal. At first, no doubt, a few of the more enlightened, in all likelihood, out of the more charitable motive of guiding the ignorant proselytes gradually into a deeper glimpse of the inter-esoteric purport of it all, kept in with the movement. But for this intelligent minority fringe, it would have quickly gone the way of 1,000 minor emotional surges and revivals among the, quote, many in all history. Through these learned esotericists, however, as Gegenberg says, it made a link with Hellenistic philosophy, that same philosophy that men like Tertullian were to revile and berate as having nothing to do with the faith of the man Jesus. As ironically enough, it most certainly did not, except by errant misconception and confusion of the two, by stupid presumption of knowledge. The same philosophy that, in spite of its scorn by the dumb leaders, was to come to the salvation of the rabid faith that sneered at it, and thus provided its only link of appeal to the interests or intelligence of thinking men ever since. There is potency enough in the statement that without the introduction by the Gnostics and others like Ammonius, Saccharus, Polonius, Clement, Origen, and even in part by Augustine, of the rational elements of the great Hellenistic philosophies, as Christian writers themselves assert, the new religion could not have kept its hold on the world's attention for more than a generation or two. Gegenberg traces with what can be considered general accurately the gradual development and progressive amalgamation of the currents running in the whirling maelstrom of early Christian agitation. He says, quoting page 118, quote, "Naturally, however open as the Christianity of the past apostolic age would be to influence of such a nature through the fluidness of its dogmatics, and flexible as it would have been rendered by Pauline and Johanna's speculative thought. It had not foreseen these developments, nor did it possess any means of sifting and more sharply defining them. For this reason, their first efforts to work them over were marked as much by disorder as by intensiveness that is. Some time necessarily elapsed before the main body of the membership, always tardy in arriving at a clear consciousness of the real situation, sensed the fact that they were driving the faith in two very different directions. The one moment tended to borrow from Hellenistic culture all of its ideas that were capable of rendering the early Christian doctrines once more profound and more beautiful. Then in brackets it said, let it be noted that Christianity had to borrow from Greek philosophy to become both more profound and more beautiful. In brackets. It is evident that this process of assimilation cared little about scrupulous exactitude, and neither did it always find itself in complete accord with logic or reality. The same was true of these documents. It only sought to establish a working agreement between the elements of the fundamental postulates and the most important principles of Greek thought. End quote. It will not be time ill spent to pause for a brief examination of what lies before us in this exhibit. The world has been asked to believe that the Christian movement was the dissemination of a body of divine revelation, first and uniquely proclaimed as a given time time almost from the skies by a divine avatar or Messiah Christ, persisting intact and amid other and opposing religions, and finally winning the world. Is there anything remotely suggestive of all this? Is the historical true picture? Instead, we find that this divinely promulgated faith, quote, borrowing us and assimilating, and with almost reckless disregard of scrupulous exactitude, end quote, and out of all accord with, quote, logic and reality, end quote, accommodating itself to Hellenistic philosophy. Indeed, it had to go a begging to the Hellenic learning even to come upon the deeper import of its own, quote, postulates, end quote. And only by the aid of Platonic wisdom did it come to find its own material of dogma and doctrine, but more profound and more beautiful than its own offerings. Here is the disclosure of error in a tradition that ought to shake a world of religious fetishism and blind belief out of its delusions. That a host of passages of such similar apostolic revelations of mangled truth had been written and read, and nothing done to align general misunderstanding with the facts as they stand, is harrowing evidence of the hopelessness of trying to shake religious hypnotizations out of their lethic opposition of the common mind. Gegenberg had conjectured that Paul changed the apostles, that is, the ideas of the Christ, by telling them that he had been a celestial hierarch and was on earth as the incarnation of the Spirit, that is, the pneuma of God. Pneuma is, I think, meaning spirit. One has to ask where simple fishermen would have learned about the pneuma of God. Such a datum goes far to prove that these simple, quote, fishermen, loudly boasted of as children in mental culture, either were not historical men at all, or that they were somehow in the intellectual grade and attainment of universal wranglers, familiar with abstruse and recondite philosophical technical terms, the Holy Ghost having worked a miracle by inspiring untutored men with the divine knowledge. And how does Gegenberg know that Paul told the 12 fishermen anything? The historical existence of both the Galilean Jesus and the 12 disciples is questioned on the most solid of grounds, lack of actual evidence, and the implication of a host of, quote, internal, end quote, evidence contradicting it. No Christian historian examined in much reading has claimed that Paul ever contacted or apparently ever heard of the man of Galilee, and therefore it is unlikely that he ever told the disciples, if they did exist, anything in person. Then Gegenberg characterizes the second wing of the Christian movement, the first having been described above. Quote, the other movement known to Christianity from the 2nd century and possibly even earlier sets out from a different starting point. It too seeks to inflate the too simple confession of faith of the early days and to excavate deeper foundations for it. It can accomplish this purpose only by combining it with beliefs and theories borrowed from its surroundings. But in the first place, it shows no discrimination in its choice, which settles upon numerous features widely different in nature. The Olympian paganism, Orphism, as Orphism, diverse Oriental religions, systems of philosophy, everything is gathered into its net. In the second place, it takes no interest in reconciling what is borrows with the historical data or even with the traditions of the faith. Instead, it pretends to possess a special revelation of its own, which it uses to justify most anomalously combinations of ideas that constitute real synchronistic systems, in which true Christianity appears as only one more element. It becomes almost unrecognizable as parts of a complicated cosmology and an abstruse system of metaphysics, neither of which owes anything of value to it. End quote. If there is a true historical record, and nobody has found warrant to dispute it, there is here again a disclosure of unrecognized truth that confutes all common belief about the early history of Christianity, finding its first professions of simple faith too bodiless, too ephemeral, too subject to the flows and ebbs of pietism fervor, too much an emotional surge with little or doctrinal rock to which it anchored in bark. Christianity sought to find firmer moorings by appropriating and tying in which itself the more stable structure of the great Hellenistic philosophy. But such was the want of discerning intellectual power in its ranks that it grasped almost anything within its reach among the religious it brushed against in its environment. It levied toll at once on Greek, Chaldean, Hebrew, and Syro-Egyptian ideologies, and said the narrator appropriated their elements without discrimination. So they're borrowing these things. They're borrowing everything and putting something together here is what they're doing. That's what they're saying. They're taking things from everywhere, everything. It's like a smorgasbord. They're taking every little thing, such and such, and putting on the plate. And then what they're saying is simply, this is Christianity. And if you deal with people who don't know what you're talking about, and it seems really, really nice and exciting, they're not going to be able to understand what you're talking about or be able to discriminate if it's true or false. And it's also based upon emotionalism to the people around you are in frenzy about this, and so it's just like a tide. This is what happens, and sometimes with in wars, so to speak, at first, until the reality comes home and says that people are getting killed. Could anything testify loudly than these facts the utter absence of any power, either of apocalyptic divine revelation of supernatural truth from heaven above, or even of human accompaniment in the way of effective systemization of resistant fragments in the movement of Christianity? What it all projects on the screen? Groups lifted to near frenzy by religious affiliation, feeling that their height of zeal for the kingdom of God gave them the right to claim any and all expressions in the religious domain as inclusive under the all-dominating tide sweep of their wild ebullience. All this makes it a proven case that Christianity was by no means a particular specific system of anything at all in the realm of organic thought structure, but instead was only a mass fervor spurring its intoxicated partisans onto the excesses of emotions and aberrations of every sort and degree. So there was no logic to this at all. There was no, mindset to this at all. And we know if it was God, if anything comes from God, it is not haphazard. It is going to be logical in a lot of ways. It's going to make sense because we come from God, you see. The unbounded faith in Christ and abject surrender to him carried them easily over the wildest abysses of logical inconsistencies, and even enabled them to spurn the truth of fact. To spurn the truth of fact. I'm sorry. They reached out to claim and appropriate everything in sight until the little core of their own nest egg contribution, the Christ made flesh in one man, becomes but one element in the large accumulation of their borrowing. Christianity is thus seen to be nothing but a hodgepodge of assortments of scraps from prevalent religions around it. It's like basically, like he's saying here, taking scraps of this and that. Like, for example, let's just give an illustration for a woman's dress. So this is a hodgepodge of what I call different cloths being put together from other pieces that are not being used and then put together. But yet it doesn't have any semblance of being what I would call any, I'm going to say not beauty, but basically would be all kinds of different fabric involved, and it would just be ridiculous in some ways in what it would look like. Historically, a testimony strengthens at every point the thesis that Christianity was a direct product of the soil of already existent religious systems, and in no sense a new implantation from the heavens. My oh my. It is alluring to go on with Gegenberg as he limns the picture of the early development still more in detail. Quote, to put it differently, perhaps preferably, the inflations borrowed from Hellenistic culture they had selected and fitted into their system were treated as properties of this postulates, even in that wonderful school of Alexandria, of which Origen was the pride, which completed the masterpiece piece, the metamorphosis of Christianity to a revealed and perfect philosophy. End quote. One again glares at us from out this statement. This Christianity, which allegedly came full blown in its cosmic perfection from God through his Son, this mental wisdom from the cleft brow of joy, J-L-V-E, this finished system, firstborn light amid heathen darkness, in reality was so anemic that it had to be kept alive only by forcible transfusion of viral blood of truth from surrounding pagan philosophies. Whatever may have given it its initial impulse, it ended shortly by being jumbled in a melange of already existent systems perfected by the genius of the Greeks. It is therefore categorically concluded that Christianity was, as here contended, simply the conglomerated reorientation of some prominent elements of ancient religious cult teachings, given a more unfortunate and ruinous distortion of meaning and referenced by ignorant miscomprehension. That is the essence and gist of all Christian history of origins, and anyone who attempts to represent it in terms inconsonant with this analysis is laboring amid phantoms. For still further enlightenment details, another step with Gegenberg is probable. Quote, the ritual development of Christianity advanced step by step with the dogmatic and by the same process. It began with very simple practices, all taken from Judaism. That is baptism, the breaking of bread, the imposition of hands, prayer, and fasting. Then a meaning more and more profound was assigned to them. They were amplified and gesture familiar to the pagans added, that they were loaded with the larger interests. For example, embraced in the rites of the Greek and Oriental mysteries, and thus charged, as it were, with the ancient formidable power of magic. This work was instituted as soon as the apostolic faith was transported from Palestine to Greek soil. End quote. While this excerpt is pretty definitely corroborated of our position, it still is necessary to wrest a dissent from one of the historical association in the passage. He falls into the inevitable habit of Christian theorists in thinking that the more penetrating insight of the Christians took over practices and forms used by the pagans in total incomprehension of their intersignificance and imbued them with truer and deeper meaning not known before. This assumption has been advanced times without number and rests on no evidence anywhere discoverable. It's simply the Christian determined to leave no laurels resting on the brow of paganism. The truth is as nearly the exact contrary as could well be. The truth out as long, the truth out as long last is that the pagans had possessed and admittedly at one time and place or another already lost the true esoteric import of all the rites, the symbols, and the rituals of the archaic of the mysteries. They administered them with splendid understanding until such time as a subtle and elusive mystical evidence of apprehension had effervesced and vanished. If not known to every ancient higher plane, faith, or any mystical god or psychosham of his candidates in instruction, this inner core of meaning was presented and preserved in Plato and Pythagoras and abstruse philosophers of Orpheus and Hermes Trismegistus. Whatever high equivalent meaning inherited in the insignia lay in the hands of the pagans and never came to the surface again with the Christians. It was finally in Christian hands that every last vestige of true interior sense at spiritual or mystical level was always swept aside and indeed violently negated and cast away. So they used it for a period of time, and then they just simply chunked it. It is timed as purely conjectural presupposition that Christianity took the empty shells of pagan belief and clothed them, as Daniel Webster said that Justice John Marshall did, with the skeletal, that is the skeletal form of the American Constitution with the flesh and blood, a real meaning and power, should be tagged for the brash and founded falsehood that it is. Christianity it was that despoiled every doctrinal symbol, the crucifixion, the temptation, the baptism, the transfiguration, the Eucharist, the miracles, and every parable of its golden meaning in paganism. And it is therefore back to paganism that we have to go to recover every treasure of light that Christianity bartered away in its purchase of the favor of the masses. And can the next paragraph from this candid writer be passed by? This is page 121. Quote, it is sometimes very difficult to tell exactly from which pagan rite a particular Christian rite is derived, but it remains certain that the spirit of pagan ritualism became by degrees impressed upon Christianity to such an extent that at last the whole of it was distributed through its ceremonies. Moreover, the power of the clergy was singularly enhanced by the almost exclusive right which they very early acquired, despite some faltering objections of ordering and dispensing the magic power inherited in the rites known as sacraments. End quote. Again, there is ground for astonishment for what is here revealed, bearing on the refutation of age-old Christian claims. In every Christian history, the pure power of the Christ in the heart of the believer has been set over against the claims of pagan spiritual magic. The one divine in its purity, the other infernally diabolical. Yet here is the intelligent chronicle of that history, asserting that the Christian priesthood actually built up its claims to be the wielders of divine unction of magic by taking over the rites of pagan origin. It is here given to us by a Christian narrator that magic inherited in the pagan rituals before the Christian priesthood claimed that all spiritual power flowed from the fountainhead in Christ, a historical person. Obviously, it has been the interest of priestcraft ever since to hide these historical anomalies. What they did was, and I've said this before, simply they took the pagan writings and put those in. They used them. And yet they didn't have any idea what those meanings were. And yet they made them literal. Again comes the statement already corrected, that is in page 123, another quote here. This order of clergy presides over the rites which more or less directly barred from Judaism or the pagan mysteries. Though entirely readapted to Christian uses and reinvested. The chief of them, at any rate, with the magic, mystical powers which the secret cults of Greece and the Orient had rendered familiar to the men of those days. Nevertheless, Christianity became a real religion, the most complete of them all, because it had taken the best they possessed from all of them. End quote. Here again is the record of borrowing from outside and readapting to Christian uses. And it had to be, I'm going to ask this, but there had to be someone at the top here or some select people. This wasn't haphazardly done. Okay, this had to be done by a secluded group of people at the very top in order to use this to make this work. That's my perspective here. I could be wrong. And again, must protests be made against the subtle insulation that Christian readaptation baptized the borrowed practice with a new spirit of light and power. If, however, by readaptation, Gegenberg means that in total ignorance of the true inner import of the magical rites, the Christian contorted them over to fit their own new and literal readings of spiritual allegories, dragged them from their lofty mystical reference down to suit the predication of the carnalized Jesus, in other words, a body. That's what it means, carnalized, and his ostensibly biography in the Gospels. Yes, sadly enough, it is true that they effected such a drastic readaptation. It was precisely that readaptation that ruined true Christianity, you see. It was that reorientation of all truly Christian meaning which constituted the betrayal of pagan religion to ignorance and misuse. What he's saying here is what I'm understanding, that the pagan religions such and such were not what I would call meant for the public. Because again, a lot of it's mystery schools, a lot of it was done that way. Some of it was such and such pagan, yes, but that's where they got all this at. They got a well full of stuff. They got it from Greek philosophy. They got certain parts of it from pagan religion, and they put it together. And it had to be someone who had a brain of some type to put this together and make it work. But it is categorically denied that this transferal meaning from the world of spiritual consciousness to a supposedly living personality implemented the first infusion of true meaning into these things. That's correct. What they did was simply they created the Jesus, they created the Christ, who was nothing but spiritual, and then claimed that he was human when there was no human Jesus ever. You see, they wrote the script. What is affirmed is that the readjustment of their substance to a new view utterly subverted all true sense which they formerly bore for knowing pagans. As to Gegenberg's vigorous final assertion that Christianity became the best and most perfect of all religions because it appropriated the best of all of them and presumably synthesized them, in other words, putting them together like a fabric, them all into a perfect organic whole. This must be viewed as another of those wholly gratuitous predications that flow so unturously from the pens of Christian apologists. It is so obvious, not true, become history records that it was at Alexandria that the highest and most enlightened project of syncretism of religious system was effected, never in Palestine. Well, the library at Alexandria had all this information there, folks. It was all pagan. A lot of it was all the history, whatever you want to call it, there. But Gegenberg says on page 2023 that this religion of Christianity so synchronized with itself, constructed, declares itself invulnerable exclusively. It stands rigidly aloof from any other religion, even though the stiffness subjected it to the severest of perils, particularly because it challenged the animosity of the state as well as that of the civil community. Should want to ask why the conventional answer would doubtless be forthcoming that Christianity held something that no other religion had, the precious, all-sanctifying grace of God, manifested uniquely to the world in the person of his only begotten Son, sent to earth to pay the ransom for sinning man. Their possession of this item of transcendent blessedness worth their collecting the best truth out of all the surrounding faiths, but close the door to fellowship with any of them. Indeed, the singular outcome proves the narrowness and not the broadness which should flow from true synchronism. It it negatives the thesis of sound synchronistic principles. It might be supposed that the blessed possession of more knowledge or assurance of God's grace would generate in the fortune beneficiaries a far wider graciousness of fellowship in the spirit of sharing its banal treasure, which never loses by being lavish abroad than the empty-handed heathen could have exhibited from their poor store. From those who are the more lavish, endowed, and blessed, more is to be expected. Yet what do we see? Fuller tells us in the history of philosophy what we see, and the story runs counter to what we would have a right to expect from the divinity commissioned Christian movement. He writes in page 328, quote, "The new growth, however, differed in one vital respect from the old. The service of the gods was one of a philosophical freedom, as long as their existence was not denied, and even that could be safely challenged, that is, saved in religiously hidebound communities like Athens. Freedom of criticism and speculation was unprompted by interference from priests or populace. Heresy was as yet a thing unknown. It even ran to unbounded philosophical license," he adds. Quote, "Still, such license were preferable to the straits in which philosophical speculation now found itself. Christianity was founded on revelation, but now the true version of the nature and the constitution of reality, which in the past had been sought by the use and tested by the standards of reason, was made manifest once and for all to all mankind by God, speaking at sundry times and divers manners by the Hebrew prophets, in those latter days by Christ. There was no gainsaying the content of this revelation, however repugnant to reason it might seem. Even to question it was heresy." You hear that? I'll say that one more time. Let's say this real clear here. This makes it very clear here, because it's a quote. "Even to question it was heresy, and heresy might mean death." End quote. So there is the rock deal here. In other words, what I'm trying to, what he's saying here very clearly, if you quote unquote question this at that time, you are questioned to be a heretic. Okay? And there were some folks. And some were basically banned from the church or banned from the area where they lived. Never heard anything more from them. Pelagius was one of those. Marcion, I don't know what happened to him also. We don't know if he was also deaf, whatever. You see, because if you begin to control all this stuff, you can write whatever you want to write. And you can destroy whatever you want to write. In other words, you can destroy all the books, which is what part of this done. That's what they did at Alexandria and other particular libraries. They chose to destroy it. That's the end of the quote. And the inevitably conclusion, which writes a historical damning count in the whole indictment of Christianity, follows. Continue, quote, "Under Christianity, then the status of philosophy was reduced, in theory, at least, to that of a slave. She was deprived of her essential activities of inquiring freely into the nature of the real, capital REAL, and of fearlessly publishing the conclusions drawn from her investigation. Her task, nonetheless, mental for the greatness of the cause into whose service she was impressed, was to expound and defend the content of a revelation in terms acceptable to the intellect as far as this was possible." End quote. This is mob rule. in a lot of ways here, folks, too. Ruthlessly as Russia today, that is 1949, lays hold on philosophy and art and science and reduces them to servitude to the cause of its world control program, did Christianity drag philosophy into captivity in the service of its cause, deemed holy and beneficial? Let's go back to this whole statement he says about Russia today. At this time in 1949, Russia was a communist state. Okay. When the communists came to power, they truly said what was true from what wasn't. And you did not, if you didn't agree with them, you were disposed of. Solzhenitsyn speaks about that. So you see the power of, at that time, what we call the Soviet Union, but this is still, the power is still there. The Soviet Union did not fall until 1989. And I don't even know if they actually fell in reality. It may have been a quote unquote a psyop, okay, to fool people, especially the people in the free world. That's my theory. Okay. Anyway, so what it did simply was it basically, now philosophy was no longer the queen of science or king of science, so to speak. Now Christianity was completely at the top, and it says whatever it says, and you don't like what it says, too bad. So if Rhodes, the careful historian, did it reach out, appropriate what it felt it could utilize of the treasures of the contemporary religions and bend them to its service. If history should ultimately decide that 15 centuries of total silencing of the truth-searching instinct of the human mind, exerted in free inquiry, has not been too costly a price to pay for the symptomatic philosophical investigation to a large, quote, revelation, end quote, that was itself only the corrupted version of earlier spiritual genius, then we may hail the capture and degradation of, quote, divine philosophy, end quote, by the bigot Christians as a victory for faith and zeal. But this is to accede to the proposition that intelligence and light can be harnessed to the chariot of ignorance and darkness. This painting of the picture throws Christianity capture and enslavement of philosophy in the 3rd century in true perspective for the first time. Historian after historian has seen this development, included in its account, and more or less curiously dilated it upon it. Scarcely one of them has paused to comment on it as being perhaps history's most doleful tragedy and most calamitous human failure. Inasmuch as the genius of the race has advanced immeasurably, furthered in knowledge and discovery in the 2 centuries or less since it has been liberated from the thralling hands of ecclesiastic fanatism, than it was able to do in some 15 centuries on that alleged holy throntum. The bald inference is that Christianity has held back human progress by just that many centuries. Even this glaring object's lesson of history is blinked at and kept from natural emphasis. The truth is that Christianity was just some more nibbling at the same feast of primitive wisdom which all systems have drawn their first nourishment, but in the case the nibbling was done not by capable philosophers and men of balance, but by illiterates in the main, who plunged into a wild scramble to grab at it for the sake of the rabble. And this rabble could do nothing but rend it into meaningless chibolicas of miscomprehended phraseology as soon as it laid its defiling hands upon it. And at one time or another, later on, more knowing minds did labor to coalesce the scattered fragments picked up in the wild melee of early ignorance into some approach to dialectic coherence. And it will be instructed to record another evidence that Christianity, the simple faith of the apostolic fervor, had virtually changed character in the years following its initial impulsion, so as to become something quite other than it had been at the outset. Guggenberg gives us a pointer to this effect that should not be missed or left out of account. Contemplate the Christian church at the beginning of the 4th century, and some difficulty will be experienced in recognizing in her the community of apostolic times. We shall not be able to recognize it at all, end quote. A community of simple unction of the Spirit, or of the emotions so easily mistaken for the Spirit, had by this time, through his efforts to meet and hold his own with one of or all of the cult systems hemming it around on all sides, become so complex a mixture of all these elements as to bear little resemblance to what it was when little groups of pietists had first launched it into the currents of religious unction of that day. We turn to Lundy again, Lundy, author of the valuable old work called Monumental to Christianity, and find him corroborating our position, yet saying particular things that need to be challenged. We can agree with him when he says that treatises on Christianity, quote, do not deal as they ought to do with the simple facts of an entire primitive Christianity before Protestantism and Romanism had existed, end quote. That is what the work here projected aims to do. But how he came, sorry, but how he came, sorry, how he can be half right and half wrong in the same sentence is shown when he says that. Quote, these religions were all, indeed, systems of idolatry, perversions, and corruption of the one primordial truth as held by such patriarchs as Abraham and Job. And yet these religions contain germs of this truth, which it became the providence of Christianity to develop and embody in a pure system for the good of mankind. That is definitely, the statement here is definitely half right, half wrong. Yeah, you can see that part, can't you, in this quote? Very clear for sure. Yeah, gonna probably have to break here in a minute. How true he is in saying that the various separate systems in their esoteric or more public and popular developments were all perversions and corruptions of that one primordial truth. That is, in brackets here, with the necessary correction that Abraham and Job were not historical, but allegorical type figures in the ancient mythical representation. The brackets are as the end of the bracket. We here attest. It can be said without too much risk of error that all religions at all times, since that primitive revelation, have been just such more or less drastic perversions and corruptions of its pristine grandeur and truth by its incompetent human understanding. So then those that were on the scene when Christianity arose were in this category. Some were more crassly distorted than others. A few, the esoteric, possibly held to the archaic truths pretty closely, thus being less corrupt. But how wrong Lundy is in asserting that it became the providence of Christianity to, quote, to develop and embody, end quote, the germs of this truth, end quote, and in another quote, in a pure system for the benefit of mankind, end quote. We most vigorously proclaim. Since it faced the opportunity, it might be considered the quote, providence of Christianity to knit it up the frail strands of the great primitive truths into a potent system for the true edification of mankind. I can remember being at seminary, and I bought into this stuff, so but it's the will of God. You see, that was the excuse they gave. Well, this happened, and it was God's will. That was their attitude. Well, something happened badly, such and such. Well, but yet it was in God's framework, and it worked out okay in their reasoning. So that was God's will. That was the way they kind of saw this answer, so to speak. This whole diatribe and say, well, it was God's will. It worked out for us, such and such, da 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 da. And naturally, as being even at 40 years old at that time, I was a sucker. You see, I believe that. And I think a lot of people have been suckers because most people don't have the time or the desire to look at these things. They just say, okay, all right, we live in the greatest country in the world, da, 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 da. It must be because of Christianity, da, 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 that type of thing. You see, people people are involved in it, and are involved in the church, such and such, and it doesn't matter what it is hardly anymore these days, Catholic, Protestant, whatever. But in reality, simply is that was their idea. The other thing I remember when they would share was, just see how is it done. You know that most don't know church history. Nobody knows church history, folks. Um, they would just simply say they would. This is the excuse they would say. So when a group of people, what they'll call Anabaptists, which are today present Amish and Mennonites, were butchered by not only by the Lutheran Church, which is German Church, not only by John Calvin in Geneva, but also by the Catholics. Excuse me, excuse me. Um, what right do you have to kill other people? Because they justify it because simply they look at the scripture literally and they look in the Old Testament and they say, oh, well, this is what happened. See, God judged Egypt. See what he did? He destroyed them, such and such. Well, if that's what God is, then he isn't a God of love, is he? Kind of makes a quagmire of the whole thing, isn't it? Well, we're on the winning side here. No, you're not. Only a few will see the truth, folks. Those who are in the majority, or whatever you want to call it, or the crowd, as a Frenchman says, majority is never right, never has been, and never will be. Because people do not think, they don't read, they don't understand, and they choose to be that way. And that's why that's the way things are on this planet. Everybody today wants to be entertained because I don't want to deal with reality in this place. You see. And so this is the back to that. Well, and that was the whole idea. Says, well, they took their religion seriously. That was what the professor said to me. They said it was they just took things seriously, such and such, and we don't do that anymore. Really? Really? Where the hell do you get that shit at? I mean, think about it. So God is one way or the other, such and such. Well, that's because he's God. No, that doesn't work that way, folks. God is logical because we are logical if we think about it. And we develop in such a way as we use our mind for the benefit of helping others. We have a heart, yes, and we have a mind. But the problem is simply is that Christians make excuses for their belief system because, frankly, it doesn't hold water anymore. And I'm not saying everybody's perfect, and that's not what I'm saying here. The point simply is saying here is that you have made you created something that God has never been. So you have made God a idol. You put him on a pedestal and you look at it literally and you think that's the way scripture is read, when in reality it is not literal. But we get that from the Romans and partially the Greeks, but mainly the Romans in our own society. But anyway, that's what Professor said. They took these things seriously, Brent. And I remember saying, well, why did they kill the Anabaptists? Well, they were somewhat on the fringe. Yes, but aren't they Christians? I didn't know this other stuff here. See, I didn't understand that. Well, they took these things seriously. And yeah, we did have some radicals in the quote unquote Anabaptist deal. You did. I gather that. But it was just a way that they basically didn't have an answer. Let's continue on. It never did tie together the loose and tangled threads of the pattern to anything remotely resembling the original in unity and beauty. Origin saw what was to be done and tried his hand at it. This this, the closest effort in the right direction, was savagely attacked and beaten down. It lost the keys to this very secret and therefore left the design of consistent wholeness still irrationally disjointed, with the constituent parts wildly jostling each other in any thinker's sane reflection. It is one of the oddest of the quirks of history that the very numb of Christianity failure should be put forth as the rock of its success. It levied tribute on all the pagan cults in a way that Gegenberg asserts bore no relation to intelligent syncretism at all, and ended by covering all paganism with its blanket of universal condemnation. Yet they took the works from them. How dare you? Giving no thanks to previous systems for its wholesale pillaging. Even in the long run, denying the pagan sources of much of the material had made off with. The arrogancy of the people at the top, you see. The whole chapter of its history has been marked with complete insincerity, if not outright misrepresentation and coverage of facts. Perhaps it can be granted that Christianity did bring out the principles of the hidden wisdom for the intended edification of the populace. But the tragedy that resulted sprang from the fact that it offered cryptical mystery teachings to the lowly in a form that turned their beneficial potentiality into a darkening of the mind through the conversions of luminous allegory and into ridiculous history. Proofs of this will come later. It is singular that this author, a man of fine analytical mind, could err so egregiously in some particulars or the situation as in this passage in another, to be cited when in between he writes one of the most keenly discerning reviews or surveys of the period, completely in harmony with our exegesis. Quote, it is most singular and astounding fact sought to be developed in this work, that the Christian faith as embodied in the Apostle Creed finds its parallel or dimly foreshadowed counterpart article by article in the different systems of paganism, here brought under review. No one can be more astonished at this than the author himself. It reveals a unity of religion and shows that the faith of mankind has been essentially one and the same in all ages. It furthermore points to but one source and author, end quote. If these words inspired by their author's clear momentary vision of the virtual identity of all ancient pagan systems and their common, quote, source had been recognized as truth and sculpture in enduring stone on the front portals of all temples in all Christendom, there is no question but that world history would have proceeded on a course of felicity engendered by the fellowship of faith instead of being disfigured by the division and mankind into groups expressing mutual assertability. And it must be entered on the record here that if there was one influence which more than any other tended to obliterate the marks and memorials of that fundamental unity and homogeneity of all religions, and hence to foster disunity in this greatest of all arenas of human communion and fellowship, that influence was Christianity. Yes, indeed. They created a split. And if you don't believe like we believe, off with your head. And I'm not saying that's the Catholics. Yeah, okay, we dealt with them. Now it's like the Protestants and the that is to deal with Calvin and Luther, but yet they did the same thing with the Anabaptists too. So their hands are just as bloody as the Catholics. For this was the religion that, in a passion of bigotry and fanaticism, flung itself upon all the great literate evidences of the deviation of its own and other forms and doctrines from the supernatural source and author of light, and wiped them out of existence. Ever since that woeful day, also its churches' list temper has fostered religion, division, and separatism to an inordinate degree. So what he's talking about simply is they just continue to create division in order to say they're bad, they're bad, they're bad. You see. Then follows Lundy's unweaving and insupportable claim that quotes in here. So this guy's apparently what he's saying, somebody's all over the place. Quote, Christianity is simply the full development of the old patriotic faith of the world, as Abraham and Job and Melchizedek held it, the complete realization and emphasis of the one primal religion given to mankind. Already refuted, this claim needs only the comment that Christianity was no development of that aboriginal gift at all, unless rank dismemberment and despolitization of a faith of all its true sense and organic unity in what is taken to constitute development. It is a gain in knowledge to record Lundy affirmation that the primal religion was the unity of all elements in a religious truth, but no facts warrant, quote, realization and effervescing of it, effervescence of it, end quote. With infinite reluctance, it has to be said that, on the contrary, it was the corroding and catalytic influences, the expressed deflorescence of that primitive wisdom by its transferal of mystical realization into empty husks of literal events. Lundy later states in page 202 that Christianity degenerated by association with paganism. Quote, the church had now placed herself under the fostering care of the secular power, which was yet half pagan. What wonder it is that she degenerated with such frightful rapidity as to almost overwhelm by Mohammedanism by reason of her dissensions, corruptions, and weakness. Was the weakness borrowed from a distant Oriental Brahmanism, or was it inherent in the Christian community itself? End quote. It is not quite illogical to lay Christian degeneration at the door of its association with paganism, from which it had drawn all its basic principles, save, of course, its transformation of the Christos spirit into a historical man. Rather can its deterioration be traced to the ignorant misconception and mishandling of the body of esoteric teaching it had picked up and then completely turned into its instruments of derationalization, only so far as a measure of the same tendency to stupid literalism may have crept into the mystery interpretation and ventilated their received message. Could paganism have been a party to the corruption of Christianity? It was Christianity's own default and defection from the esoteric side of paganism that led to its degeneration, its dissension, its corruptions, and downfall. So what this guy is doing here is interesting. He is apparently he is I don't know if he's a Christian or not. I have no idea, but he's speaking out of one side of his mouth and then speaking out of the other side. He's trying to make everybody happy when in reality you're not going to make anybody happy because you're not telling the truth. And we're going to conclude this last part here for tonight. Great light shines for us in G.R.S. Mead's studies and findings as announced in his Fragments of a Faith Forgotten. To refute the claim advanced by Gutenberg and Lundy that Christianity affected the synchronism of the old pagan system into a true and the best religion, we have asserted that that was not the case, but that the great work of synchronism was done by the Hellenistic at Alexandria, some Christian, others non-Christians. Mead's conclusions are strong evidence in support of this thesis, page 118. And we're going to end at this point at the night because it's getting late. And it's approximately an hour and 28 minutes here that I've been talking, and I'm a little tired. So I appreciate you being here. Thank you for attending. I hope that this will kind of give you an idea of where Alvin Boyd Kuhn is coming from. And Alvin Boyd Kuhn is I'm trying to think right quick. I forgot it right just like that. He's a I can't get it. He's not it's not, I guess you would say in some ways he's esoteric when he looks at things, but he's also not a Rosicrucian, but is in similar veins to that. He's not to the extent of what's the great guy from not from Poland? What's his name? It's not from the esoteric. There's we got all these group of people Hold on a second here. Let me see if I can remember his name here. I've got a book by him. A couple books by him actually. And he actually broke away from Rosicrucian himself. Um, I don't see the book right in front of me here. I think it might be over here in my other section. Yeah, trying to remember who he is. Rudolf Steiner. So that's who I'm talking about. Rudolf Steiner was the one that broke away from Rosicrucians and then did his own thing. Um, anyway, it's getting late. Like I said, it's 9:40 here on the East Coast. I appreciate you again, like all who's here. Hope this is will explain some things. How Christianity chose to use pagan thoughts and intermix those things into their services, and then begin to blame the paganism for their faults. So, but anyway, thank you for being here. Like I said, and we'll be back with this probably sometime, maybe tomorrow night, and share more of this information. Again, the person who told me about this works was a gentleman named Phil Langdon, which is, I'm eating this stuff up because basically it's true, which is what I'm here to search for. And this has got to be put out there for others to see and understand. Most do not understand this particular thing and what's going on, and that's why most people are completely blind. So thank you for being here, and wish you a good night. You take care.